Nora, can we start?
Just a second, it's loading. So now you can start.
Thanks very much. Welcome everyone. My name is Barbara Breinsack. I'm at the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna. And I'm welcoming you also on behalf of my colleague Thomas Bayer, who's a professor at the Center for Medical Physics and Biomedical Engineering at the Medical University of Vienna. And those two universities are jointly organizing this lecture series, of which we have the fourth session today. And it is my particular pleasure to welcome two speakers who are Dutch, but not only Dutch, so both of them have international experience. I'll introduce them in a minute. Before I do that, I would like to make one announcement, namely that the European Public Health Week, which we are not organizing, but I wanted to announce it as it might be of interest for many of our colleagues here. The European Public Health Week will take place from the 16th to the 20th of May. There's a link in the chat. As you know, those colleagues who are here in the Zoom webinar can also ask questions and make comments today, ideally using the Q&A tool at the bottom of the page. For everyone who's listening on the website of our media partner, The Standard, we will make sure that at least some of your questions will be brought over digitally to the Zoom webinar here. So our two speakers, in alphabetical and also chronological order, I'm very happy and grateful that Professor Arjen Boin is joining us today. As I mentioned last week, it's not an exaggeration to say that he's one of the world's leading experts on crisis and disaster management, and in particular on the politics of crises and disasters and policies of crisis and disasters. He's a professor of public institutions and governance at Leiden University. Before coming to Leiden, he was at the Utrecht School of Governance and Public Administration, Institute in Louisiana State University. So he has come around, and he's a very, very prolific writer and scholar. Some of you might already know the really seminal paper from 2019 on Transboundary Crisis. Arjen will tell us what this notion means in his input. And together with colleagues, he published two books last year. One is called Understanding the Creeping Crisis. So I'm also very interested to hear what a creeping crisis is. I've actually read part of that book, so I know part of the answer, but not all of it. And the other book is called Governing the Pandemic. And both books have come out with Springer, and both books, this is particularly wonderful, can be downloaded for free from the website. We will also put the links into the chat. Our second speaker is Professor Hendrik Wagenaar. He retired as a professor of urban studies and planning at the University of Sheffield a couple of years ago. He's now a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies, IHS in Vienna. He's also an adjunct professor at the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis at the University of Canberra, and he's a senior academic advisor at King's College London at the International School for Government. And Hendrik Wagenaar is an expert on qualitative research methods. So some students at the University of Vienna know him in that capacity, but he's also one of the leading experts on interpretive policy analysis and also on policy analysis, critical policy analysis more broadly. And for the sake of full disclosure, I was the co-author of his book in 2021. So we published that book together. The book is called The Pandemic Within: Policymaking for a Better World, and it came out with Policy Press in 2021. So we ended last week's session by pondering what good policymaking in crises are, what makes good policymaking in times of crises. And I think it could be seen as some kind of easy thing to do, to bash government and to say everything is going badly. I just heard that there are now a new record number of sick people in the United Kingdom. Some public life doesn't work anymore. We have very high infection numbers in other parts of the world, despite a lot of policies addressing that. So Arjen, is it fair to say that policy making hasn't worked really well in the pandemic, or is this something that never goes well in a crisis? Is that maybe part of a characteristic of a crisis? So over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Professor Pijnstock and Professor Beyer, for inviting me. This is a real honor for me to join you in this prestigious series of Vorlesungen, if I said that correctly. Probably not, but it is a real pleasure to be with you, and I'll try to answer your question. And allow me to share my screen. And I should have done that by now. And what I would like to do is, because I'm going to pick up right on that question, is it easy? Yeah, it's easy to bash our political leaders, but in order to get a grasp of how to assess the performance, I think it's fair to look at what we expect of crisis management, but also taking into consideration how hard it is to solve a problem. And the challenge, and let's just start by saying that from a crisis management perspective, that COVID has really been an exceptional crisis. So I'm not talking about the disease per se, but the crisis aspects, and I'll tell you why. First of all, it's a long-lasting crisis. It just keeps going on. It's still with us, and that is quite rare. Another interesting feature is that even though there's only a small group of people truly at risk, a health risk, you cannot resolve the crisis without everybody. So it's a true solidarity crisis, and that makes it really, really difficult. Normally speaking, you have a crisis and a small number of people, and the rest kind of helps them. But this is all of us in order to protect a small group. Another feature is that uncertainty. Uncertainty is normal in times of crisis, but then you learn more about the crisis, you become smart, and you can solve it. And this is a crisis that keeps on producing new uncertainties. So, we keep running behind the ball, and we never seem to get on top of it. And this is a really difficult crisis, where the sense of urgency kind of comes naturally. People experience the crisis. There's a sense of urgency. We're all in it together. Here we have the ebbs and flows. And sometimes people need to be almost provoked into, this is really a crisis. Come on, people, behave. Sometimes people are probably a little over panicky, if you will, and they have to be calmed down. And this is, of course, a challenge. And we were just talking before about the importance of communication, and that comes in right here. How do you communicate a common perception about the nature of the threat? And speaking of the nature of the threat, what is that threat? We have economic problems. We have, of course, a health crisis. We have a vaccination issue, and more and more, I think, a public resentment issue, and people starting to really dislike governments imposing measures of, freedom imposing measures on them. So let's unpack the idea of crisis management. What is crisis management? And in our field, we say that these are really a collection of different tasks. So it's not one thing. And I'm singling out 5, and you'll recognize them when I explain them to you. So the first one is, you have to understand there is a crisis. You got to detect it. You have to define it. You have to call it. And that whole idea of the creeping crisis is a crisis that is already there, and the experts see it. There's an accumulating threat. The politicians and the public refuse to see it, and this is a common problem in policy land. So Professor Wagenaar will undoubtedly say something about that. You know, it's what we call the politics of attention. So how do you generate attention for a problem when people are worried about other things, and no doubt important things? The second task is sense making, and it's understanding the crisis, the causes, the dynamics, but also the consequences. And as Professor Wagenaar will explain to us, there are intended consequences and unintended consequences. And they're both very important. Then you have to respond. You got to do something. And I'll talk about that in a second, because that brings us to the whole idea of how to deal with vaccinations, for instance. Communication is, some people say, educating the public, teaching the public, but there are many people trying to do this. So there's many, as policymakers say, policy scholars like to say, there's frames, and different frames. And just because you're the leader doesn't mean you have the winning frame. And so you can speak of a frame competition. There's a real, almost a little war going on. Who has the winning story about the nature of the crisis and what to do about it? And finally, it's important that crisis managers learn, especially in a long crisis. You want them to see, like, okay, this didn't work, so let's try that, or we look at another country that seems to work there, so why don't we adapt that? And so learning and adaptation is also important, especially in a long-term crisis. Now, what is then good crisis management? And this is the same question you could ask about what is good policy. So it's really the same thing. And being normative, I throw out what I think is important, but you can disagree. You can say, I really don't think that one is important, or this one is important. I think when I look at crisis management, of course, it's important that it's effective, that you stop the crisis if you can, or minimize the damage, if you will. I think most people would agree on that this is an important norm for crisis management. But there's more. It also has to be legitimate, and that means the public, or at least the public at large, needs to find it acceptable what the government is doing. And then a third one, and I think that's undersnowed and not always understood, is that there is an ethical dimension to all this, especially when you use your power to impose freedom limiting measures. And so this is where government takes crisis management or crisis powers, usually enshrined in law, and then an ethical perspective, I think, is important, and I'll get to that in a second. So what have we seen about crafting a response? And I think this will, because I'm not very familiar with what's happening in Austria, in your country, but I'm pretty sure that the patterns are similar. So I think what the policymakers, every time they think they got to figure it out, they learn that citizens also learn. And citizens then, they change their behavior. They also anticipate what governments might do. So there's a very interesting disappointment almost baked into this process, where policymakers then learn that what worked the last time doesn't work this time, because citizens behave differently last time than they're responding this time. So it's and I'm sure Professor Wagenaar will have something to say about that more intelligently than I can. The big dilemma always is between effectiveness and legitimacy. So things that are effective are not always legitimate, and what plays well with the public is not always effective. And in the short run, in the immediate early phase of a crisis, the public is very forgiving. So they're willing to sort of postpone judgment. But as the rally around the flag effect kind of dissipates over time, then the public really is formulating its own wishes and desires, and they may contradict the effectiveness of an approach. And this is, of course, very frustrating for policymakers who have experts telling them, you should do this because this is the way to go. And then politicians saying, well, that's just not going to happen because that won't fly and it's not popular. We're not doing that. And another tension in crafting these responses is the ethical dimension. So let's say, so it's very common to have a utilitarian approach in crisis management, where you say, this is the aim and we're going to do everything to accomplish that aim. And most people will probably agree with that. And then there's something pesky, there's these constitutional individual rights of people, usually a minority that to which it pertains. So here comes the true question of leadership. Where does the utilitarian approach end, and where do individual rights begin? Because there is always a tension in a crisis. You sometimes have to pause, if you will, individual rights for the greater good. But is that always the case? Under which conditions? And that is a debate that is usually not held in a transparent way. And finally, here, what I would call the opportunistic use of the precautionary principle. So the precautionary principle meaning to say, we want to make sure nobody gets hurt, and we'll do everything so nobody gets hurt. That sounds fantastic. But leaders are, they sometimes use it and then they don't. And that brings us to a set of tensions, and I call them pitfalls in a crisis. So there is, when you talk about communication, a need to be clear and have a clear message. Everybody will probably agree with that. And clear messages work better than vague messages. At the same time, there are, especially among policymakers, there is a tendency to think that you cannot share everything with the public because they might not understand it. It may cause panic. So there's what they perceive a need to conceal certain arguments. And of course, that doesn't work. Because you become inconsistent at some point, and the public senses that, and it becomes harder to explain why you do this now, why that you didn't do last couple of months ago, or the other way around. And then this all hangs together with the entirely normal desire of politicians to please their public, especially in a long-lasting crisis. You want to reward the public for good behavior. And that leads them to introduce measures that may not be smart. Let me just put it that way. And finally, what I've seen is that leaders do develop, not all of them, but especially those where the early phase worked well. So, the first or second wave was brought under control. Leaders like to think that they did that, and it was their smart policy that accomplished that, even though it was probably the public and maybe their fear for the virus that motivated them to behave in a way that worked in such a way that the wave was brought under control. Leaders like to reduce that to the smartness of their operation. So you get a sense of hubris. So these are pitfalls. This is not good for crisis management. And now let's bring all this together around the vaccination mandate, because I think that's been the most controversial element of the crisis response during COVID-19 in many countries, including yours, if I understand correctly. And you can almost see where, after a long time where the government wants to return freedom to their citizens and want to please their citizens, that they want to give them freedom even if it's not possible. And the vaccination mandate comes in very handy there, because it suggests that it is possible, because you have a culprit for if it goes wrong, the unvaccinated. And so it's important, I think, because it's such an intrusion on individual rights. And let me be clear here, I am not against vaccines. So this should not be interpreted as doubting vaccines or in any such way. I am just talking about the effectiveness and legitimacy and ethical sense that a vaccination mandate, especially where you have individual rights in a constitution, and I have no idea how that is organized in Austria, but for instance, in Holland, that is the case. And it's important to be clear what the aim is. So our government told small little lies about that. So they were suggesting that people were protected if you forced people, or if you just said, you can't come into restaurants if you're not vaccinated. So they were defining the unvaccinated as a source of the problem, which is simply was not true. To be sure, the unvaccinated did not cause the spread of the virus. They caused a problem in the hospitals. That's a different problem. And that our government never defined it in such a way. The results that I've seen from the vaccination, we didn't have a mandate. We had that 3G where people, if you weren't vaccinated, you couldn't go into the restaurants. But the results that we've seen in Holland were an erosion of trust among a small but significant part of the population. Lots of debate, even among vaccinated people who did not understand why their unvaccinated friends could not join them in the restaurant, even though everybody was sitting next to each other and being equally vulnerable to spreading or getting the virus. But more importantly, perhaps, this, I think, the way it was introduced without deliberation, without a good debate about why we should limit constitutional rights, introduced us to a slippery slope where government now can say it's a crisis, so we get to do what we think we need to happen. And in the end, it was a decoy, because the real problem was that we lost discipline and that people did no longer respect the rules of engagement, how to stop the spread of a pandemic, and totally understandable. So the question then is, this brings us to policymaking. You can make decisions as leaders, but that doesn't mean you make good policy. And that's where I hand it over to my colleague, Hendrik Wagenaar, Professor Wagenaar, and the policy expert. And he's going to tell us how to make good policy. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Professor Boin. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
I'm here again. Okay. That was very stimulating and interesting. And as the theme of both of our presentations is policy making, I will introduce you to the concept of policy making in my talk and explain why policy making, even under the best of circumstances, is a challenge to every government and what that challenge consists of. So picking up on Arjen's talk, that in times of crisis, it is even more of a challenge. But before I start, I want to thank Professor Preinzak, Professor Beyer for inviting me to this series of Vorlesungen, and Professor Preinzak in particular for her very kind and generous introduction of me. Let me share my screen. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the uneasy alliance between politics and policy. And let me ease into my topic with an example where something didn't go quite as the policymakers planned it to go. On January 19 this year, the citizens of Amsterdam were treated to an unusual spectacle. The Concertgebouw, the world-famous concert hall, had been transformed into a hair salon. You could get a haircut there. And people did, while they were listening to Charles Ives' Second Symphony I wish I was there. So what was going on? The musical hair salon was in fact a playful example of the unintended use of public policy. And that's one of the most common mechanisms in public policy that drives the law of unintended consequences. The Dutch government had just relaxed COVID restrictions on businesses. So that included restaurants, cafes, hair salons, gyms, even sex workers. This is the Netherlands, right? But it had dictated that theaters and concert halls should remain closed. And this resulted, of course, in puzzlement, in anger, and in subversive action by actors and musicians. So a few days after the musical hair salon, the cultural sector was allowed to open its doors again. So the government made a small U-turn. Now, this small example of civil disobedience contains a very important lesson for politicians. When you issue a law, or when you make a policy decision, make sure that you know how to implement it. And before I continue, I'm going to explain to you and say a little bit about the notion of policy making. So the German language, interestingly enough, similar to the Italian language, by the way, doesn't really have a word for policy. The English language distinguishes between politics, that is the negotiation of different interests in society, public administration, which is the day-to-day management of the public infrastructure, and policy, the transformation of public goals into public action. Now, there are many definitions of policy, but a good one, a simple one, is that policy is everything that governments do to realize democratically agreed upon goals, usually with an intention to initiate something new or to improve an existing state of affairs. Effective policy making requires thinking in advance about the means to realize that policy. Now, this might sound very obvious and straightforward, but for various reasons, this lesson is often forgotten, as Austria discovered when it hastily announced a vaccination mandate in November last year, and discovered in the months that followed that it didn't have the means to implement it. Politics and policy maintain an uneasy relationship with each other. And they are condemned to live with each other, but they do that in mutual suspicion. And also, as this beautiful etching from Goya shows, would like to be freed of each other. Now, one reason for this is that political actors, in focusing all their attention and all their energy on political deal-making, consider its implementation an afterthought. And this error of attention is, by the way, reinforced by political science, which has accorded only a secondary status to policy studies, and usually considers the study of elections or political parties or political leadership much more worthwhile topics. This attention bias, by the way, is also reinforced by the media, which are much more interested in politicians for their talk shows than in administrators. Look at ZIP 2. Now, a second reason for the stubborn belief is a stubborn belief by most elected officials in the command and control view of policymaking. That means the command and control view is that it means that the official issues a law or an instruction that is then thought by them binding to lower level administrators. Now, both of these understandings of policymaking are fatally flawed. In country after country, no matter the nature of the political system, the political landscape is littered with a wreckage of failed policy decisions. And, I must add, with the ruined reputation of politicians, for policy failure is not without costs. It incurs considerable reputational damage, as well as cynicism among the public towards government and its officials. And we have seen a lot of that in the last 2 years. So in the remainder of this presentation, I will discuss two essential elements of policy implementation. First, policy design, that is the choice of policy instruments, usually a combination of policy instruments, that will allow elected officials and administrators to realize their decisions. There's nothing particularly new or innovative about what I'm going to say. The theory of policy instruments has been around for at least 40 years, but it has lost nothing of its relevance and nothing of its urgency. So it's maybe one of those insights that every new generation has to discover for itself. And second, I will argue that even when you have done your homework and you have established a well thought out package of policy instruments, you still need to be aware of the special nature of policy implementation and what it takes from lower level administrators to make a policy work. I will argue that it is best to involve these lower level administrators, and actually also preferably also the target audience of the policy in the design of the policy. And I call this collaborative governance. Now, in the next section, I'm going to just explain to you why policy like houses, clothing, or cars needs to be properly designed. Governments engage in a huge number of activities, every government. So think of collecting taxes, constructing affordable housing, arresting people, giving out contracts, monitoring banks, authorizing medication, paying out welfare to the needy, and so on, and so on, and so on. To create order in these activities, policy scholars came up with a simple taxonomy of policy instruments. And I'm going to first define policy instruments for you. A very simple definition of policy instruments that you find in many books on this topic is the techniques and means through which states attempt to attain their goals. Now, if this sounds a bit technical to you, overly technical maybe, I completely agree. So therefore, I added the thoughts of the policy scholar Deborah Stone, and I had the privilege to be taught by her many, many years ago. Deborah Stone prefers rather to speak of ongoing strategies for structuring relationships and for coordinating behavior to achieve collective purposes. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, but if you think about it, it does a few things that the first definition doesn't do. It has the advantage that it draws attention to the core of every policy instrument, namely that you want people, or businesses for that matter, to do something that they usually wouldn't have done on their own, such as paying taxes, or to drive slower, or use less energy, or stop smoking, or get vaccinated for that matter. As you can't possibly force people to do all these things, not even in a totalitarian state, you can constantly force people to do things, you need their cooperation. Each policy instrument, for that reason, contains an underlying theory of how to change people's behavior. But the application of a policy instrument also contains the possibility that people will use the policy instrument for their own purposes, differently from what the government intended. They might, for example, turn a concert hall into a hair salon. Every policy instrument, once it has left the politician's press conference, is a precarious balance between compliance on the one hand and resistance on the other hand. That is what policy instruments are all about. Now, policy scholars distinguish 5 types of instruments, and I'm going to just walk you through it. This is the boring part of the talk, and it's actually also the boring part of every course on policy analysis and policy theory. First, there are organizational instruments. These rely upon the use of government organizations, government institutions, government personnel to realize policy outputs. Examples are obviously city agencies or police departments or the tax office or the financial authority or appellate courts. And nowadays, very importantly, also non-governmental organizations and private companies that have contracts to execute public tasks. So think of the company Lead Horizon that organizes PCR testing in Vienna, for example. The second group are authoritative instruments. And these rely on the power and ability of governments to realize policy goals through the use or threat of state-enforced sanctions, punishments, in other words. An example are speeding fines to discourage people from driving too fast. And regarding COVID, think of the laws and the lower level regulations that allowed for the temporary closure of businesses and allowed for mandatory mask wearing. The third group are financial instruments. These are specific techniques involved in transferring resources from the Treasury, the Ministry of Finance, to encourage or discourage people to do things. So by providing financial incentives, you encourage certain desired behavior. For example, by subsidizing solar panels, you hope that people will transfer to renewable energy. And by imposing costs, on the other hand, you discourage certain behavior. So think of high parking fees to discourage people from driving their car into the city. In COVID policy, the subsidies to businesses to survive the lockdown are an example of such a financial instrument, but also the $600 fine that was suggested for being unable to show a proof of vaccination. And also the ultimately rejected vaccination lottery. Authoritative and financial instruments, as you can see, they merge into each other. The fourth group are information-based instruments. They're very, very important in our society, and they are defined as those policy techniques by which the government provides information or collects information in the hope that it influences behavior. So good examples are the almost daily graphs of new infections and ICU admissions that the government issued, but also information campaigns that persuade people to get vaccinated. And finally, the last group are networking instruments. And these consist of attempts by government agencies to bring together actors from government and civil society to inform them or to inform itself, to consult or to coordinate the design and implementation of policies. An example is the GECKO committee of experts that advises the Austrian government on COVID policy. The purpose of networking instrument is to bring more and more diverse information to bear on the issue at hand, so to overcome the challenge of complexity that every government faces. Now, all this may sound obvious and may sound very straightforward, but in the real world of policy design and policy implementation, the choice of instruments is a messy process that is influenced as much by knowledge of the civil service, and that's formal knowledge, that's informal knowledge, as by tradition, political culture, symbolism, convenience, accommodations, and above all, ideology. Many politicians turn the policy process on its head. They have a favorite instrument, let's say market-based solutions, and formulate their policy and the analysis of the problem to fit the solution. So if you have a hammer, you will always find something to pound on. Policy instruments vary according to a number of features, such as resource intensiveness. So think of administrative costs or operational simplicity. Another feature is targeting. How precise are you in reaching your political target? Think of political risks, the chances and the nature of opposition and the type of resistance that the instrument triggers. Another feature are the constraints on state activity. You might want to do something, and as Arjen also explained, but ethical principles might limit you in doing it. Some commentators argue that each type of instrument has a characteristic implementation profile of advantages and disadvantages that policymakers must take into account when they contemplate the realization of policy. For example, regulations are reasonably cheap and can be targeted with precision. However, they often generate resistance. They are rigid in that they do not take individual circumstances into account. They require a monitoring and enforcement procedure to give them bite, and they might distort markets by burdening producers and consumers with additional costs. So I'm moving now from instruments to the more general process of policy implementation. National laws reflect the moral ambitions of the ruling elite with regard to a particular social issue. But if law wants to go beyond a purely symbolic function, these ambitions require translation into action. This inevitably raises a whole series of normative, administrative, and practical questions. In the early days of public administration theory, policy implementation was seen as a top-down affair. The law was a set of instructions, or even less realistically, binding commands that were issued by central government to lower-level administrators. In books on policy implementation, this is still often the starting point that is then immediately dismissed as unworkable. So what are the problems with this top-down model? Well, first of all, different actors will interpret the practical implications or even the goals of the law, of a policy, in different ways. The law or the parliamentary decision is seen as a kind of instruction to administrators, and that instruction is interpreted differently according to local circumstances and local values. So, for example, and this is an example that I studied myself in depth, Dutch Parliament legalized brothels in October 2000 and admonished cities to consider prostitution as a form of work, complete with worker rights and work conditions. Brothels were then regular businesses, small businesses. City administrators, however, prefer to think of prostitution as both a security and a morality problem, and acted according to this interpretation of the law by imposing very, very strict operating conditions to brothels that resulted in the closure of over half of these establishments. That clearly was not the intention of the law. So divergent interpretations of laws and rules are not always a bad thing. In fact, many policy scholars argue that it is a necessary requirement of making the rule to work in practice. This is called administrative discretion, very, very important element of policy implementation. The official is in administrative discretion is not only guided by the content of the rule, but also by social and professional norms and the specific circumstances of the citizen. Excuse me, my screen acts up. Yeah. The aim of administrative discretion is to attain both effectiveness and fairness in rule application. The second point to consider in policy implementation is an extension of the first. Laws need to be translated into procedures and into regulations that suggest how members of the target groups are expected to behave, and how relationships between government agencies and target groups and relationships between citizens and the state are organized, as Deborah Stone already said. A new law and the procedures and regulations that generates will have to be fitted into a very dense landscape of existing administrative procedures and processes, both formal and informal. A considerable part of that work is very technical, and it requires detailed, hands-on knowledge of hundreds, if not thousands, of rules and procedures, something that an ordinary politician cannot even begin to understand. Another part is a deep practical knowledge of the policy domain at hand to ensure the workability and acceptability of the regulations. And thirdly, all this work has to fit local circumstances. While that fit with the regulatory environment, the policy domain, and the local circumstances is usually far from perfect, administrators will always try to design rules that do not conflict too much with existing regulation and that promise a desired outcome in the real world. And it is for these reasons that administrators at lower provincial or city levels of government do most of that concrete work of policy implementation. So the conclusion I draw is that policy implementation is a kind of original sin of public action. You can't avoid it, no matter the political color of the government or the nature of the governing regime. It's hard to do it right, and you will always be tainted. The laws of policy implementation apply as much to democratic as to authoritarian or collectivist regimes. It is therefore best to think of policy implementation as an evolving administrative practice, an ongoing administrative practice. But unfortunately, for the politician, it is a complex and dispersed practice that is largely out of their hands and involves a large variety of administrators, local administrators, as well as the public, the target audience. And each of these groups interprets the implementation practice in its own way. Given this state of affairs, it is not surprising that so many policies are either never realized and quietly abandoned after a while, or they result in unforeseen and often counterproductive outcomes. Now I'm almost there, I'm getting to the end. What can policymakers do to negotiate the complexity and unpredictability of policy implementation? The literature on complexity is unanimous. Instead of denying complexity, policymakers should embrace it. So simplified policy narratives and simplified control arrangement are forms of denying the complexity of implementation. That's also the kind of hubris that Arjen talked about a while ago. Embracing complexity means not to approach it as a liability, but to make it productive, stimulate variation, facilitate new communication lines, select and promote solutions that work. These are general strategies for effectively navigating complexity. Collaborative governance with stakeholders is a practical way of facilitating requisite variation and interaction in policy implementation. Collaborative governance is a governing arrangement where one or more public agencies directly engage non-state stakeholders and often also each other in a collective decision-making process. That process is formal, it is aimed at consensus, it is deliberative, as it seeks to implement public policy or manage public policy programs. Collaborative governance is inclusive. It involves all stakeholders, particularly marginalized groups. It is authoritative. It has an official decision-making mandate from political authorities, and it proceeds by authentic dialogue. Now, what is authentic dialogue? It is a particular form of face-to-face dialogue that observes the requirements of accuracy, comprehensibility, sincerity, and legitimacy. And for those of you who know their Habermas, they will recognize these conditions. Politicians would be wise, and this is my final statement, to consider collaborative governance as an integral part of all policy design. However, why this is not likely to happen anytime soon, I'm afraid would be the subject of another lecture. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much again to both of you. And one of the questions that I have immediately is, how do we put that in practice? What you just said, Henk. But first of all, let us give the word and voice to our colleagues in the virtual room. Sabrina, would you talk about political grief? Would you like to speak up, if you can, technically, and explain what political grief is? And you have a question also for the speakers, if you like to, otherwise I'll read it for you.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can also, but then I have to shift my laptop because you are on this big screen, and then I can turn on my camera.
Don't worry, whatever is easier for you. Okay. We can hear you very clearly.
That's actually really, yes, like also a tricky question for me as well, because I'm just trying to also define it from different sources. So as much as I can grab it so far, political grief? That was the question, no? Like to shortly explain it.
Explain it, and then you can also ask the question that you typed to our speakers.
Right. Yes. So where to start? So political grief is more a collective dimension of grief. And then it is very much based on the context. So for example, what I found interesting on the PhD topic I was looking at was the flooding in Germany. I don't know if you're familiar with the big flooding that happened. There it was looked upon political grief more in the sense of leading to empathy, and then that a social movement or social aid, support group on Facebook was developed. So like it was more looking on how does it motivate action. But in itself, it's still tricky. And this is also one of my aim, to understand better what political grief is. But it's a collective grief that joins up people in action. So it's actually, there's also the question, is it just grief or is it already empathy and then a motivational act? So it's not
but
just
political grief could also be grief over injustices. And okay. So, and you have a question for our speakers.
Yes. So now, sorry, I have to just open it. Yeah. So generally, I was just wondering how you see it in your field of work or your area of research. If you see political grief at all or collective grief playing a part during a certain crisis, like now looking at COVID, for example, and how is it looked at from these different maybe areas of crisis management, leadership, politics, policy making, and if at all it is there, and is it used to make sense, for example, I was asking myself, or to understand better a certain crisis and also a certain group of people acting within it, because maybe it's also interesting to understand more about it, like in sense-making aspects. So anything, if you know something about that, would be very helpful for me. Also, if you know academics or professionals writing about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina. And maybe it's important also to point out that one dimension of political grief is also the pain and loss incurred by policy. And we heard quite a bit on that from Arjen and from Henk now. Who would like to start?
Well, I certainly can say something in the disaster sociology. The whole idea of collective grief is a very well-known construct. After a disaster, when a community is hit by an event that causes death and destruction, then collective grief is a very powerful force and something that politicians have to reckon with. After a terrorist attack, collective grief can be canalized towards inner group, outer group thinking, where you almost manipulate or channel the collective grief to anger towards another group. So collective grief can be, by the very smart leaders, they can manipulate it and use it. And that's what political scientists, of course, are very interested in, how they do that. Now, during COVID, is very interesting because I think we lacked collective grief. And in many countries, there's talk about, shouldn't we commemorate, the thousands of people that died in our country, and how would we do that? And who are these? We don't even know who these people are because they're spread over 2 years. And so it's really, then it becomes the framing of the event, who the victims are, and what the grief then is, becomes very important act. And that, I think, is being done quite differently in many countries. And it's still playing out. And I also believe that the whole idea of them pinpointing a culprit, so a group of people that may have a role to play in this, that you can blame, is also happening in many countries. So yes, this is a powerful concept.
Henk, thank you very much. Henk, would you like to add something?
Yeah, but I would like to add a more general point, and that has to do with the relation between policy elites and the public. And in the spirit of Deborah Stone's relational understanding of policy instruments, she doesn't talk about instruments actually, but about strategies and solutions, which I think is more interesting than this very technical term instruments. But in the spirit of the relational view of that, I think what we have seen is that some politicians were not so aware of the fact that in almost everything they say and do, and in the policies they suggest, they implicitly project a certain view of the public, a certain status to the public. So a very simple example we had in the Netherlands, when just after a new lockdown was issued, the Dutch king thought it wise to jump on a plane and fly to his holiday villa in Greece. That led to a huge outcry, that there were some rules for ordinary people and then rules for the elite, and he turned around, saying somewhat sheepishly he was just bringing his daughters to their holiday destination. And we have seen how similar behavior in the UK almost brought down Boris Johnson. It's still not resolved, that issue, although the heat is off a little bit. But I think in general, it's very important that political leaders understand, or policy elites, politicians, that almost everything they say has this effect on people, and often in very unpredictable ways. So.
Thanks very much. We have a question from Jakob. And he asks, is there an objective way for decision makers to estimate and quantify the collateral damage that their measures to contain a crisis could cause? For example, what is the collateral damage of lockdowns on mental health, for example? And also for context, we did discuss last week in our session with Alexander Kekulé that there are different levels of collateral damage: the collateral damage of the virus itself, the collateral damage of illness, but also of pandemic measures. So are there ways to, also thinking of other crises, other ways to quantify that? I think this is a question for you, Arjen.
Well, it's certainly been an ongoing effort, especially initially by economists in insurance companies, to get a grip on what the costs of disasters or crises are in the short and the long term, because we should not forget that the effects may play out over a long time. And but you know, how to quantify it becomes very hard if you not just look at mental health, for instance, but if you also look at the opportunity costs, which is, you know, what you could have done, what you could have accomplished if we did not have the virus. You know, what we have done in those past 2 years. I mean, those are scenarios. I mean, you can talk about it, you can debate it, but I don't think you'll ever agree on you know, what those costs would have been and opportunities. And so I think, and this is also, we should not forget, this is where politicians really, not just politicians, but also opposition politicians and journalists and victims, try to manipulate, or try to frame, I should say, frame the situation in their favor. You know, if you're responsible for the response, then you want to downplay the effects. If you're in a victim group, you want to exaggerate. So think of the group of long COVID patients. They're really manifesting themselves now, and they would love to have, you know, quantitative indicators to demonstrate their plight, and that is just very difficult because we're still understanding what long COVID is. As far as I'm not a doctor. So yes, I recognize the question, but I wouldn't be too optimistic about accomplishing it.
Can I say something about it, Barbara?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
I think it's an important question, and Arjen said wise things about it. I also think, and this is not meant as criticism, but a focus on quantification also can lead to a certain myopia, a certain short-sightedness or tunnel vision, because the numbers then suggest, whatever numbers they are, that the crisis hits everyone equally hard. But we have now seen over and over again with the COVID crisis, and actually also recently with the flooding in Australia, that these hit the poor much harder than the well-off, and that is very difficult to put into numbers. But it is an essential element of understanding a crisis, and such as a pandemic or these recurrent floods in Australia. Just wanted to add that.
Thank you very much. I will now read two questions from colleagues who I think speak to a similar problem, namely, how do we put this in action? So Georg asks, the crisis gave the impression that some Western democracies did not have suitable crisis management, or they could not apply it satisfactorily. Do you see a real chance to learn from this crisis to better prepare and to more effectively deal with crisis in the future? So is this realistic? What needs to happen also? What would be your suggestions as to how we can put this in practice? Because one could say this is all good. We know in theory how it works. In practical terms, what would need to happen? And Anatol is offering a strategy already, which he also phrases as a question. How should politicians react to misinformation on social media and elsewhere? Should they react to it? Is this one of the things that are part of a effective, so the communication aspect, the information and knowledge creation aspect, is that part of what we need to do next?
Would you like me to go first? Sure. So learning is a very important process after any crisis, because you don't want to make the same mistakes in the next crisis. At the same time, and we studied this a lot. How does that work, and what is effective learning? And unfortunately, we can't be too optimistic. So it's not so easy to learn from a crisis, because usually is what we call it's a unique case. Crises by definition are unique. So how do you establish beyond some reasonable doubt that there's a causal relation between what a government did and the outcome? I mean, it's usually hard to compare. Now we're in COVID. This is unique because all countries have dealt with the same crisis, and it's a bit of an experiment. Most countries have done different things, and we have a lot of data, and it plays out over a lot of time, and there's a lot of money going into this. So yes, this is a unique opportunity to do some real learning that is usually a lot harder. So am I optimistic? Well, I'm optimistic about the opportunity for sure. There's two ways of learning here. One about purely pandemic management, how to manage a pandemic. So all and it's more generic. What lessons about crisis management can we learn here that work in other types of crises? And I think the second question falls in that domain. So misinformation was a problem during COVID-19, but that's a problem in any crisis. So we know that in any crisis there are rumors. We used to call these rumors. Now it's called misinformation. But so the phenomenon is the same. The only difference between that there is an active effort to mine or weaponize, if you will, uncertainty. And people are so desperate to understand what's going on that they become susceptible to good stories that are convincing, not necessarily true. And social media help to propagate good stories among groups that are willing to take in those stories. And so what should governments do? Well, again, here, they have been trying. Governments are routinely monitoring all social media for all sorts of stories. One way of looking at it, which unfortunately does not seem to be very helpful, is the idea if you present the facts, people will understand. That's just not happening. And I think what a better way is to perceive this as a war of ideas, and see that you have to present a better idea. And what is a better idea is a more convincing story. Henk had some features of a good, he had 4 features of good policy, which you can be read as 4 features of a good narrative. And maybe Henk can repeat them: sincerity and legitimacy, whatever. The 4. Yeah. But this is, to begin with, it starts with that government leaders have to understand that this is an arena, and you have to take it seriously. You have competition. If you don't take it seriously, others will step in the arena and they will actively try to forward their frame, their ideas, their narrative. And just because you're the leader in charge, it doesn't mean your frame is going to be the winning frame.
Thank you very much. We have one question from the Q&A here, which I will combine with one from the Standard website, and then our colleague Professor Beyer has a question. But first, there was a very interesting post on the Standard website where somebody's saying, well, we're talking about policy failure in this pandemic crisis, or in this crisis, the pandemic, but and here the person is referring to Austria. We're seeing policy failure all over. So is this the era of policy failure? And if so, why? And then, and I think this is directed to you, Henk, in the Q&A section, Michael asks, you talk about complexity. Can you give us an example where complexity thinking and design thinking has actually solved the problem?
Yeah. Well,
so maybe we start with you. Henk.
Yeah, thank you. 2 excellent questions. Let me first begin with the first one. Is the era of policy failure? That's a very interesting thought. I don't think so. I mean, anybody who reads a bit of history knows that there have been huge policy failures in the past. There's a very prominent narrative that it was a string of policy failures that led us to the First World War, disastrous policy failures. But like so many other things in our days and times, things get, enlarged, as it were, through 24-hour media and social media and the internet. So, and what that does is that leads to reflections. It also leads to all sorts of other unpleasant things, but also to reflections. Why is it that things go wrong so often? And thus, some of the things I said in my presentation, policy making, so to trying to effectuate positive change in a society is unbelievably difficult, I gave a little critique of political science in the intro to my talk, but I really have I'm passionate about it. Let me put it this way, because I don't think that these problems that are very real problems and issues are necessarily well understood by political scientists. And I think they should get a much more prominent position in the discipline. Now, are there examples where complexity thinking has solved problems? Yes, there are several. I'm going to give you a concrete example, and then I'm going to make a more provocative statement. I did quite a bit of research on citizen initiatives in what is called disadvantaged neighborhoods, so very poor neighborhoods that all suffer from lots of problems like unemployment, high disease rates, low life expectancy, bad housing, and so on and so on. And in some of these neighborhoods, we saw citizens coming together to try to solve those problems. And what was fascinating is that they were often much better at it than local governments or national governments. And I wrote a paper about it where I connect what these citizens were doing with a kind of pragmatist and pragmatic approach to complexity. So they didn't put the problems in boxes that were then separate. So a housing problem was also a health problem, and a health problem was also a problem of communicating with ethnic minorities, and the problem of youth crime was also a problem of overworked parents who had to hold 2 or 3 jobs to get by, and so on and so on. Excuse me. And people were in a much better position to tackle those issues. I'm not going to say holistically, but more, you know what I mean, in a much more general sense, not specialistically, as it were.
I think this relates to what we're going to discuss in a moment with Thomas also, the transboundary nature of policymaking. And
yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in a general sense, I still have to see a policy initiative where people genuinely engage in collaborative governance that didn't produce better outcomes than so let's say traditional policy making. And I say it deliberately provocatively because it's also rare. Why is it rare? Because not many officials are willing to give these other parties in the collaborative dialogue the kind of power that they require, the kind of responsibility that they require to lead to good outcomes. But once you do it, and you see it more often at lower levels of administration, it usually leads to very interesting, creative results. Anyway, so that's somewhat of an answer to these 2 questions, I hope.
So you're saying not necessarily that citizens are better policymakers than professional ones, but the collaboration and working and thinking across different policy areas, that's really important. So, but thank you, Henk. Arjen, is policy failure a characteristic of our era, or is it something that happens in crises more than otherwise?
No, I don't think it's particularly characteristic of our times. I think what is problematic about our times is the widespread loss of trust in government, and that already happened during the financial crisis. And the pandemic did not make things better. So the construction of an idea, so to speak, that there are more policy failures is more in the eye of the beholder. I would argue. If we just look at successes, for instance, which we then don't do, you're going to find many successes. But I think the real problem is indeed trust in government. And that in and of itself is quite disastrous.
Thank you very much. Thomas, please.
It's hard to follow. Thank you very much, both of you, for 2 very invigorating lectures. So my background is medical physics, and thus I may not be able to use all the terms that you used in its professional aptitude. But I want to touch base on the paper that you, Arjen, wrote, and which Barbara mentioned in the introduction, on the transboundary crisis, which we should possibly put in the chat. Unfortunately, we did not put it at the reading materials and on the webpage. When I read this, I come up with 3 questions, actually many more, but the time is running out. One point I want to make is that, to me, the national politics and our very national-minded thinking is all but a magnifying glass to a much more global perspective of this crisis. And I wish more naively that as the crisis took hold of the entire planet, there would have been organizations like the WHO or other organizations who would have taken more of a leadership role. Why do you think this has not happened? Or take it more closely with the European Union. Why was it so difficult for the European countries to align on a common strategy, which could ultimately lead to policy making, or at least, if I may use that term correctly, to indications of what should be done by the member states? That's number one. And then number two, the other question I have is, you demonstrate in your paper also ideas about how to move out of this and preparing for an effective response. And you say that the underlying idea is that the people know what is good for them and they know about this best. Does this really call for providing them with sufficient knowledge through education, training? Barbara mentioned in the earlier discussion, social infrastructure, to really give them everything we know about life and thus make them educated citizens. Would this help in upcoming crises? I don't know if I was clear, but I have so many ideas. It was really both the talks as well as this paper triggered a lot of thoughts.
Well, thank you for the question. So the problem with transboundary crisis is that the causes are outside of your reach, so to speak. Even though you suffer from the effects, so something that happens somewhere else. So the Ukraine is producing, the war there is producing problems for us in terms of, let's say, inflation or expensive energy, and there's really not much we can do about it in the short term. And so in a crisis, that becomes even harder, because the pressure of crisis, that is the moment where the nation state really is sort of, that's the core task, the protected citizen. So the nation state then usually has some sort of arrangement, in law and practice, to centralize power in some people, a group of people, wherever they are, the government leaders, however that's defined. And the one thing that, and this is very traditional, in the Roman Empire, this happened. And so this is a time-proven mechanism. Now, the only problem is that in modern governance, if you will, and this is really modern, is our idea of working together over boundaries, such as in the EU, does not fit with this national conception of emergency powers, which typically ends, so every country has a roof. So the last thing we want to do is then centralize upwards to some, unknown entity like the EU or the WHO or whatever. Here's a effectiveness and legitimacy start sort of clashing. And then the question, of course, also is, crises happen on the ground. So this is Hendrik's point, if you create an even taller ivory tower, where now the crisis is being managed in Brussels, for instance, what are they going to do? And is that necessarily better? So we're talking about coordination is really the issue. Coordinating all these emergency management systems. And that is where the solution lies. So not taking away authority, but creating ways for these countries to not just communicate, but coordinate. And we know coordination is very difficult. Everybody loves coordination, but nobody wants to be coordinated. This goes back to what Hendrik mentioned about the command and control model, which coordination tends to evolve quickly into command and control, which of course it's not. Which it should be is more a way of deliberation, to use a pragmatic term that Henk just threw out there, the whole idea of pragmatism. So deliberate. And this is, having a meaningful and smart conversation about what we should do, what you do, what I do, what we don't do. But of course, deliberation costs time. And you have to learn that. This is what you just said. You have to build citizens who know how to deliberate. In crisis, we don't have any time. There's for thoughtful deliberation, that's very, very hard. I mean, you have to bring people together. That's why we have all these NATO people, heads of state, Joe Biden flying in, because they really have to be together, and it's a few hours. So this is, I think, and I'll stop there. But we're really we need innovation here. the EU, to be sure, has been one innovative project. It's a slow-moving project, and they are building structures, especially in health, as you probably know. Building a health authority, whatever that's going to do, but it's interesting. And the crisis move faster than our efforts to redesign structures that have been built over centuries. So this is going to be a real challenge.
Yeah. Can I add something?
Please.
Yeah, that is actually to Thomas' second question, which I interpret as a question that is about the relationship between people, ordinary people, and the state. And maybe I'm interpreting it too widely, but I think it's an absolutely crucial point. And we've talked quite a bit in these two presentations and the questions and answers about the concept of policy learning. How do policymakers learn from what they do? And but I think policy learning is very, very much a two-way street. So policymakers learn from ordinary people, but also vice versa. Ordinary people learn from policymakers, and that two-way street is in practice very asymmetrical. That is, the kind of experience and knowledge that ordinary people have is often not seen as very legitimate knowledge, right? So but if you look at real world examples, and I do that through the work I do on commons, where people manage their own resource environment, you will see that type of knowledge is actually incredibly powerful, and not only that, but the people in the business of solving a practical problem, they learn an immense amount of very complicated stuff. But it is always in the context of acting on the problem. And so a lot of policy making, and I throw in a lot of ideas that each require almost a whole lecture. A lot of policy making is talk-based. We talk with each other. That's what the whole concept of deliberation is about. But the problem solving is often action-based. So also from both sides. There is, again, there's a whole empirical world out there that we can still discover, and that we're beginning to discover in very interesting around topics such as democracy-driven governance, where bottom-up citizen initiatives lead to solving real-world problems. So, okay, let me stop there.
Follow-up question, Barbara. One last question. Do you think, both of you, this crisis, the longer it lingers on, it has the power and energy to turn existing, call it policy making, call it engagement in politics, upside down? Or will we all strive as a luxurious society to go back to normal ASAP and hope for the next generation of politicians to do better? So is there a seeding, I don't want to say for a revolution, but for a modernization of society in this crisis?
Well, Barbara and I wrote a book about it, which can be both read as a blueprint for the type of modernization you have in mind. And at the same time, we are very pessimistic that much of it will ever happen. We're thinking of a second book where we address that question: how can we make it happen? But and the reason is that's in the that we argue in the book is that complexity eludes most policymakers and politicians, and B, we're all caught in what we call hegemony. So we are captives of webs of practices that literally prevent us from seeing things differently. But then even if we see them differently, we cannot make them differently, because changing a practice is very complicated, very difficult, because you need to have another practice, otherwise you don't give it up. So I wouldn't bet a very expensive bottle of wine on it that we will see the kind of change that you and I would love to see. But that's a bit of my answer. Yeah. Maybe Arjen has different ideas about this.
Well, I find that very hard to, I've been studying crisis for a long time now. And I'm particularly worried about this crisis because leaders have really, almost all of them have lost trust during the 2 years. I mean, there's very few examples. I mean, there are a few, but very few of leaders who came out winning. And that used to really be normal, for leaders to go into a crisis and the crisis will give them energy and sort of a togetherness, and we solve this together. And that's not happening in COVID. I don't have the feeling. And what worries me most is that leaders do not seem to grasp how much they've lost. And I'm still computing what that means. So I just don't know, Thomas, but it's worrying, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
So unfortunately, we are almost at the end of this session. Before I ask Thomas to remind everyone of what the next session will be about, let me thank again our two speakers, Professor Boin, Professor Wagenaar. I think we have learned a lot. We also have much more to ponder. So from you, Henk, we learned, among other things, how important it is that politics also thinks about the craft of making good policy. You said it's as important as creating a house or a garment. Also that policymakers and politicians can and need to learn from citizens in a deep way. This is not just a phrase. From you, Arjen, we learned a lot. We will also put the Transboundary Crisis on the website. We learned about the importance of timeframes. We learned how important it is that we actually call a crisis. And interestingly, last week, we also talked with Professor Kekele about what he called epidemic shame. So this would have been very interesting to discuss if we had more time. So what can help, what can give policymakers the courage or an incentive to actually call a crisis when there is one, and not to worry about losing face. So much more remains to be discussed, online and offline. We also learned from you, Arjen, the importance of considering unintended consequences in crisis from the start, and many other things. So thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who has been with us today, our colleagues at the Standard, our media partner. And that's it for me. And Thomas, can I ask you to close the session and to advertise our next session?
I'm great. I'm the marketing guru of this Ringvorlesung. I take home 3 words from your 2 prestigious talks. One is complexity, the other one is uncertainty. Both are very familiar to me as physicist, and solidarity. Just to be a bit more on a positive connotation. And thank you very much indeed. I can only resonate what Barbara said. Those who are still online, we full-heartedly welcome you to the next Tuesday session. Now that we have finished the first block where we basically defined crises, health and related aspects, we now want to deep dive into how these crises, or this crisis in particular, affected different domains in society. And we'll kick off with arts. And we are very happy to announce 2 very eloquent speakers. Sarah Wedel-Wilson, she's a professor at the Hans Eisler School of Music in Berlin, but she's also director of some of the Salzburg festivals. And Michael Flüss, who is both a doctor in radiology and nuclear medicine, as well as an artist. He is more in paintings and photography, and Sarah in music. And we welcome them next Tuesday, April 5th, in a very interesting debate about arts in lockdown, where they also bring in visual and tonal media work. And I'm sure this will be a very interesting session. And with that, Barbara, if you're okay, we'll thank again our speakers and the audience for their time and attention. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. And students who want to know about the exam by request, please stay in the room. Thank you.